It was a gray January afternoon in 1996, the kind of cold that seeps through bone. On an 800-acre estate in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, a man was working on his car in the driveway. His name was Dave Schultz, Olympic gold medalist, world champion wrestler, a man beloved by everyone who knew him. At that moment, a silver Lincoln Town Car rolled slowly toward the house. Behind the wheel sat the owner of this vast property, John Liseter DuPont, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in American history. When the car stopped, Dave walked over to greet him. He had no reason to fear. John DuPont had been his employer, his patron, his benefactor for years. The man who had given him a house, a salary, and the chance to train for another Olympic run. But something was different today. The window rolled down. Without warning, without explanation, John DuPont raised a .44 Magnum revolver and fired. 3 shots. Dave Schultz fell to the frozen ground, his blood staining the snow. His wife Nancy, hearing the shots, ran outside screaming. She cradled her husband as he took his final breaths, the light fading from the eyes of America's greatest wrestling ambassador. When the 911 operator asked why this had happened, Nancy Schultz could only give one answer: because he is insane. What happened that winter day sent shockwaves across America. A murder that seemed to make no sense. A billionaire killing his most trusted friend. A family estate that had stood for generations suddenly transformed into a crime scene. But to understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must travel back in time. Back to the origins of a fortune built on gunpowder and ambition. Back to a mansion that witnessed generations of triumph and madness. Back to the lonely childhood of a man who had everything except the one thing he truly wanted: love. The DuPont name is woven into the very fabric of American history. It begins not in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, but in the chaos of revolutionary France. In 1789, as crowds stormed the Bastille and the streets of Paris ran with blood, a young man named Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours was fighting for his life. He was an economist, a minor nobleman, a man who had advised kings. But in the madness of the revolution, such connections meant death. Pierre fled France with his family, arriving in America in 1800 with little more than his name and his ambition. He brought with him his son Liseter Hall, a young chemist who had trained under the legendary Antoine Lavoisier. While hunting in the forests of Delaware, Irénée discovered something that would change his family's fortune forever. American gunpowder was terrible. Weak, unreliable, nothing compared to the precision explosives he had learned to make in France. He saw an opportunity. In 1802, Irénée established a gunpowder mill on the banks of the Brandywine River near Wilmington, Delaware. The location was perfect: water to power the mills, willow trees for charcoal, and access to shipping routes along the Delaware River. Within a decade, the DuPont Company was supplying gunpowder to the United States military. When the War of 1812 erupted, orders flooded in. And when the American Civil War tore the nation apart, the DuPonts supplied nearly half of all the gunpowder used by the Union Army. Their fortune exploded alongside their products. By the end of the 19th century, the DuPont family had become one of the wealthiest in America. They controlled the explosives industry with an iron grip. They built mansions that rivaled European palaces. They married their cousins to keep the wealth within the bloodline, a practice that would later raise troubling questions about the family's genetic legacy. And they expanded into chemicals, creating products that would touch every American life. Nylon, Teflon, Lucite, Kevlar. The DuPont name became synonymous with innovation, with progress, with the American dream itself. But wealth of this magnitude creates its own kind of prison. The DuPonts lived in a world apart from ordinary Americans. Their children were raised by servants, educated at elite schools, sheltered from the struggles that shape most lives. They learned early that money could buy almost anything: loyalty, respect, even friendship, or at least the appearance of it. And among this sprawling dynasty, there was one branch that would produce the most troubled heir of all. William DuPont Jr. was born into privilege, but he was not content to simply inherit. He was a man of action, a lover of horses and sport. In 1919, he married John Liseter Austin, the daughter of a wealthy locomotive executive. Their wedding was called the wedding of the century by the newspapers of the time. As a gift, John's father gave them over 200 acres of prime Pennsylvania farmland. There, in Newtown Square, William's father built them a magnificent estate called Liseter Hall. The mansion was modeled after Montpelier, the Virginia home of President James Madison. White columns rose against the sky. Sweeping lawns stretched toward ancient oak trees. Stables housed champion thoroughbreds that would go on to win races across America. The couple seemed destined for happiness. They raised horses, hosted elegant parties, and expanded their estate to over 800 acres. William named his racing stable Foxcatcher, after the old hunting tradition that still coursed through the veins of Philadelphia's elite. The horses bearing the Foxcatcher colors became legendary on the racing circuit. But behind the white columns and manicured lawns, the marriage was crumbling. In 1941, William and Jean divorced in a bitter separation. Jean kept the estate. William moved away. And caught in the middle was their youngest child, a 3-year-old boy who would never recover from the fracture. His name was John Eleuthère DuPont. John DuPont's childhood was a study in contradiction. He lived in a palace, surrounded by hundreds of acres of pristine land. He could have anything money could buy, and yet he was profoundly, desperately alone. After the divorce, his father essentially vanished from his life. His older siblings, who were decades older than him, had little interest in their baby brother. His mother, John, was a formidable woman, devoted to her Welsh ponies and prize-winning beagles. She dominated the Devon Horse Show for 78 consecutive years, her animals winning ribbon after ribbon. But warmth toward her youngest son seemed beyond her capacity. Young John wandered the vast estate with no one to play with. The children of servants were instructed to keep their distance. He was reminded constantly of his place at the top of the social hierarchy, told never to trust outsiders, warned that people would only want him for his money. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that captures the essence of his childhood loneliness. John believed he had one true friend, the son of the family chauffeur. They played together, explored the estate together, shared secrets as boys do. Years later, John discovered that his mother had been paying the boy to pretend to be his friend. Whether this story is literally true matters less than what it reveals. John DuPont grew up believing that genuine connection was impossible for someone of his wealth, that every smile concealed a motive, that love itself was just another transaction. His mother's interests became a template for what she expected from her son: excellence, achievement, proof of worth through competition and prizes. But John was not drawn to horses or dogs. Instead, he developed a fascination with the natural world. He collected birds, eggs, shells, anything he could catalog and study. While other boys played sports, John wandered the property with binoculars and notebooks, documenting every species he encountered. His interest was genuine, a rare, authentic passion in a life otherwise defined by isolation. After graduating from the Haverford School in 1957, John briefly attended the University of Pennsylvania before dropping out. He eventually earned a biology degree from the University of Miami, where he also swam on the varsity team. His passion for natural history led him to fund expeditions to remote corners of the world, from the Philippines to Fiji, collecting specimens for what would become his life's work. In 1972, John DuPont opened the Delaware Museum of Natural History, a state-of-the-art facility built to house his vast collections of preserved birds, eggs, and shells. He served as its director, published scientific papers, and earned genuine respect in the academic community. For a time, it seemed he had found his calling, a way to channel his wealth into something meaningful, a legacy beyond the family name. But the museum could not fill the void inside him. Science offered knowledge, not connection. Specimens could be collected and catalogued, but they could not love him back. And deep within John DuPont, a darkness was growing that no amount of money or achievement could contain. In the 1980s, John DuPont's interests took a dramatic turn. He discovered wrestling. The sport appealed to something primal in him, the raw physicality, the one-on-one combat, the ancient tradition stretching back to the Greeks. But more than the sport itself, John was drawn to the wrestlers. These were men of incredible discipline and dedication, athletes who had sacrificed everything for their craft, men who, unlike everyone else in John's life, might actually need something he could provide. In 1985, John donated money to establish a varsity wrestling team at Villanova University, installing himself as head coach despite having no real experience in the sport. He began building a state-of-the-art training facility on his family estate. The wrestling room was equipped with the finest mats, the most advanced conditioning equipment, everything an elite athlete could desire. When his mother died in 1988, John finally moved into the main house at Liseter Hall. He renamed the estate Foxcatcher Farm, reclaiming his father's legacy even as he transformed the property into something entirely his own. John DuPont's vision was ambitious. He would create the premier wrestling training center in the United States. He would recruit Olympic champions to live and train on his estate. He would build a team, Team Foxcatcher, that would dominate international competition. And perhaps, through these athletes, he would finally find the companionship that had eluded him his entire life. The money flowed freely. John offered wrestlers generous stipends, covering all their training expenses. He provided housing on the estate for those who wanted it. He funded their travel to international competitions. For amateur wrestlers struggling to survive on meager stipends, Foxcatcher Farm was a godsend. Here was a patron willing to invest millions in their dreams, a benefactor who asked only for their presence and their loyalty. The first major recruit was Mark Schultz, younger brother of Dave, and an Olympic gold medalist in his own right. Mark had won gold at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, the same games where his brother Dave had also claimed the top prize. The Schultz brothers were wrestling royalty, the only American siblings to both win world and Olympic championships. Mark arrived at Foxcatcher in 1987, drawn by the promise of world-class facilities and financial support. At first, the arrangement seemed ideal. John was generous to a fault, but Mark soon noticed troubling signs. John demanded to be addressed as Eagle or Golden Eagle. He insisted on being introduced at wrestling events as the Dalai Lama. He would appear in the wrestling room with firearms, waving them around in ways that made the athletes nervous. He seemed to crave validation constantly, requiring wrestlers to praise his own modest abilities on the mat. John had begun competing himself, entering veterans tournaments in his 50s, despite having almost no experience. Mark Schultz would later describe feeling like a trophy rather than a person. "We were his newest trophies," he recalled. "If you did not want to be displayed on his wall, he threatened to ruin you." The relationship deteriorated over time. By 1988, Mark had had enough. He left Foxcatcher, determined to escape the controlling orbit of its eccentric owner. But the story of Foxcatcher Farm was far from over. For where Mark Schultz departed, his older brother Dave would soon arrive. Dave Schultz was everything John DuPont wished he could be. Born in Palo Alto, California, in 1959, Dave had overcome significant obstacles to reach the pinnacle of his sport. As a child, he was overweight and struggled with dyslexia. Other kids bullied him mercilessly. Teachers mistook his learning differences for mental disabilities. But Dave refused to be defined by others' limitations. He found wrestling as a teenager and discovered he had a gift for it. More importantly, he had heart. Dave was not the most naturally talented wrestler, but he was perhaps the most intelligent. He studied the sport obsessively, analyzing techniques from around the world, incorporating Soviet methods that American wrestlers had never seen. His coach once quoted him saying, "I cheated. I learned how to wrestle." By the time he graduated high school, Dave Schultz was already making waves in international competition. He won his first national title in Greco-Roman wrestling at just 17 years old. He went on to become a three-time All-American at the University of Oklahoma and a 1982 NCAA champion. But Dave's greatest achievements came on the world stage. In 1983, he won the World Championship in freestyle wrestling. The following year, in Los Angeles, he claimed Olympic gold, joining his brother Mark in one of the most remarkable sibling achievements in Olympic history. Over his career, Dave won 10 senior national titles across 3 weight classes, 7 world and Olympic medals, and became the only American ever to win the legendary Tbilisi tournament twice. But statistics cannot capture what made Dave Schultz truly special. He was, by all accounts, the most beloved figure in international wrestling. He learned Russian so he could communicate with competitors from the Soviet Union. He named his son Alexander after a Russian wrestling friend. He was the first to congratulate opponents who defeated him, hoisting them on his shoulders in celebration. He had time for everyone, from Olympic champions to beginners just learning the sport. Dave married Nancy in the early 80s, and together they had 2 children, Alexander and Danielle. Wrestling was their life, but family came first. When Dave's competitive career began to wind down, he transitioned into coaching. He served as an assistant at Wisconsin, Stanford, and Oklahoma, passing on his knowledge to the next generation. But the economics of amateur wrestling were brutal. Coaching salaries were modest at best. Training for another Olympic run required resources that Dave simply did not have. Then came the offer from Foxcatcher Farm. Despite his brother Mark's warnings, Dave Schultz agreed to join John DuPont's program in the early 1990s. The arrangement was too good to refuse. John offered Dave a salary, a house on the estate for his family, and the chance to train for another Olympic run. The Atlanta Games were coming in 1996, and Dave, now in his mid-30s, wanted one more shot at gold. Dave moved his family to Foxcatcher Farm. Nancy and the children settled into a comfortable home on the property. For a while, the situation worked. Unlike his brother Mark, Dave had a remarkable ability to manage John DuPont's eccentricities. He was patient where others were frustrated. He was direct where others were evasive. When John claimed to see ghosts coming out of the walls, Dave calmly told him there were no ghosts. He became John's confidant, his calming influence, the one person who could bring the troubled millionaire back to reality. Mike Gostigian, a close friend of Dave's, later explained the dynamic. Dave was the person closest to John. He was a calming influence, a confidant. But Dave was not a yes man. If John said he saw things coming out of the walls, Dave said nothing was coming out of the walls. This honesty, this willingness to ground John in reality rather than indulge his delusions, may have been what John needed most. But it may also have been what made him dangerous. For in John DuPont's fractured mind, the line between friend and enemy was growing thinner by the day, and the man who could tell him the truth might one day become the man he feared most. As the 1990s progressed, the signs of John DuPont's deterioration became impossible to ignore. He had always been eccentric. Now he was becoming unhinged. Friends and acquaintances watched with growing alarm as his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He drank heavily. He used cocaine. He became obsessed with conspiracy theories, convinced that foreign agents were trying to kill him. He installed elaborate security systems throughout the estate and surrounded himself with armed guards. He ordered all the buildings on the property painted matte black, transforming the once elegant estate into something dark and foreboding. His demands on the wrestlers grew stranger. He insisted on being addressed by titles he had invented for himself. He would appear at training sessions with firearms, sometimes discharging them in ways that terrified everyone present. He called emergency meetings at odd hours, rambling about threats that existed only in his mind. Mark Schultz later recalled John coming into his room with a gun, waving it around while Mark and his girlfriend lay in bed. The athletes tolerated these episodes because they needed what John provided, and because Dave Schultz was always there to calm things down. But Dave could not be everywhere, and the darkness within John DuPont was growing beyond anyone's ability to contain. In 1983, John had briefly married Gail Wenck, an occupational therapist he met at a swim meet. The marriage lasted less than a year. Gail left him, she later said, because she feared for her life. In 1988, a lawsuit alleged that John had made improper sexual advances toward an assistant wrestling coach at Villanova. The case was settled out of court, the details sealed. The Villanova wrestling program, which John had funded, was shut down. These incidents were warning signs, but John DuPont's wealth insulated him from consequences. He could afford the best lawyers, the most discreet settlements. He could retreat to his estate and seal himself away from a world he increasingly viewed as hostile. The warnings went unheeded. January 1996 arrived cold and gray. Dave Schultz was preparing for what he hoped would be his final Olympic run. At 36, he knew his window was closing. The Atlanta Games were just months away. He trained with the intensity that had defined his entire career, rising before dawn, pushing his body to its limits, refining techniques he had practiced for decades. On his time away from the mat, he coached the younger Foxcatcher wrestlers, passing on the wisdom he had accumulated over a lifetime in the sport. He was ranked number 1 in the nation at 163 pounds. The dream of a second Olympic gold medal seemed within reach. On the afternoon of January 26th, Dave was in the driveway of his home on the Foxcatcher property, installing a new radio in his Toyota Tercel. It was a simple domestic task, the kind of mundane activity that fills the spaces between the great moments of our lives. His wife Nancy was nearby. His children were at home. The winter sun hung low in the sky. Then the silver Lincoln Town car appeared. John DuPont was behind the wheel. Patrick Goodale, his security consultant, sat beside him. When John pulled into Dave's driveway, the situation changed in an instant. Dave walked toward the car, expecting a brief conversation with his employer. The window rolled down slowly. John DuPont sat perfectly still for a moment. Then he raised the .44 Magnum revolver and fired 3 shots. Dave Schultz fell to the ground, mortally wounded. Blood spread across the frozen driveway. Patrick Goodale sat frozen in shock. Nancy Schultz heard the shots and came running outside, screaming. She found her husband lying in the driveway, his breathing shallow. As she cradled him, trying to stop the bleeding, John DuPont simply drove away. The 911 call captured the raw anguish of the moment. When the operator asked why John DuPont had shot her husband, Nancy could only say, "Because he is insane." Paramedics arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. Dave Schultz was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 36 years old. John DuPont retreated to the main house at Liseter Hall. What followed would become one of the strangest standoffs in American law enforcement history. Armed with weapons and protected by the mansion's security systems, John refused to surrender. Police surrounded the property, uncertain how to approach a multimillionaire barricaded in a 47-room mansion. For 2 days, negotiators tried to coax him out. He rambled about conspiracies, about threats, about enemies coming to destroy him. In the end, it was not negotiation that ended the standoff. It was the cold. Police cut power to the mansion. When John emerged to check on a broken heater, officers were waiting. They took him into custody. The man who had been one of the largest supporters of amateur wrestling was now a murderer. The question that would haunt everyone was simple. Why? The answers would only emerge slowly over the months and years that followed. A trial, psychiatric evaluations, testimony from friends, family, and the athletes who had lived in fear on his estate. But on that cold January afternoon, none of that mattered. What mattered was a wife who had lost her husband. 2 children who would grow up without their father. A community of wrestlers who had lost their greatest champion. And a mansion on a hill where blood stained the snow. The arrest of John DuPont sent shockwaves through America. Here was a man whose family name adorned museums, universities, and some of the most important chemical innovations of the 20th century. A man worth an estimated $200 million. A man who had poured millions into supporting amateur athletics. Now he sat in a Delaware County jail cell, charged with first-degree murder. The question everyone asked was the same one Nancy Schultz had screamed into the phone on that terrible January afternoon. Why? The legal proceedings that followed would expose the depths of John DuPont's mental deterioration, but they would also raise uncomfortable questions about wealth, privilege, and a system that had allowed a dangerous man to remain free for years despite countless warning signs. In September 1996, 8 months after the murder, John DuPont was ruled incompetent to stand trial. Psychiatric experts testified that he was psychotic, unable to participate in his own defense. He was committed to a mental hospital, his condition to be reviewed in 3 months. The diagnosis was severe. Paranoid schizophrenia, a disease that had twisted John DuPont's perception of reality beyond recognition. According to the psychiatrists who examined him, John believed that Dave Schultz was part of an international conspiracy to kill him. He believed that people would break into his house and murder him in his sleep. He saw threats everywhere, in the shadows of his mansion, in the faces of people who had been his friends for years. He believed that machines in the walls were watching him, that foreign agents had infiltrated his staff, that even the wrestlers he had supported for years were plotting against him. The security systems he had installed throughout Foxcatcher Farm were not the precautions of a wealthy man protecting his property. They were the desperate measures of a mind convinced that death lurked around every corner. Every camera, every alarm, every armed guard was proof of the terror that consumed him day and night. During the competency hearings, a picture emerged of a man who had been slipping away from reality for years. Witnesses testified about John's increasingly bizarre behavior. He had demanded to be called the Dalai Lama of the United States. He had worn long ceremonial robes around the estate. He had ripped electrical wiring from the walls, convinced that enemies were using it to spy on him. He had ordered the estate's buildings painted black, transforming the once elegant property into something dark and foreboding. He had driven a military tank across the grounds. He had fired guns in the middle of the night. And through it all, his wealth had protected him. When concerned neighbors called the police, nothing happened. When wrestlers expressed fear for their safety, they were dismissed. John DuPont was rich and eccentric, people said. That was all. By December 1996, John had been treated with antipsychotic medication and was ruled competent to stand trial. The proceedings began in January 1997, almost exactly 1 year after the murder. The defense strategy was clear from the start. John DuPont would plead not guilty by reason of insanity. His attorneys argued that his paranoid schizophrenia made him incapable of understanding the nature of his actions. He had not murdered Dave Schultz out of malice or premeditation. He had killed a man he believed was trying to destroy him. The prosecution faced a difficult task. They did not dispute that John DuPont was mentally ill. Even their own expert witness, the renowned forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz, agreed with the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. But mental illness alone was not enough for an insanity defense under Pennsylvania law. The prosecution had to prove that John knew what he was doing when he pulled the trigger, and that he knew it was wrong. To do this, they focused on the details of the crime itself. The evidence presented at trial painted a damning picture. John DuPont had not acted in a blind, psychotic frenzy. He had taken deliberate steps before the murder. He had gone to a stamp store in Ardmore that morning, purchased collector's stamps, and told the shopkeeper he would return on Monday to pick them up. This suggested a man who expected to have a future, not someone about to commit an act of spontaneous madness. He had selected a specific weapon, a .44 Magnum revolver, different from the smaller .38 caliber pistol he usually carried. He had invited Patrick Goodale to accompany him on a drive around the property, providing himself with a witness, but also perhaps with cover. And most damning of all, the third bullet had struck Dave Schultz in the back. Dave had been trying to crawl away when John fired the final shot. This was not self-defense against an imagined attacker. This was execution. The defense countered with testimony from some of the most respected psychiatric experts in the country. Dr. Robert Standoff, Dr. William Carpenter of the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, and Dr. Paul Applebaum of the University of Massachusetts all testified about the nature of paranoid schizophrenia. They explained how the disease distorts perception, how it creates delusions so powerful that the sufferer cannot distinguish them from reality. John DuPont genuinely believed that Dave Schultz was a threat. He believed that Dave was a Russian agent, part of a vast conspiracy. He believed that killing Dave was necessary for his own survival. But the jury was not convinced. On February 25, 1997, after deliberating for several days, they returned a verdict that attempted to split the difference. Guilty of third-degree murder, but mentally ill. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. John DuPont would go to prison, but he would receive psychiatric treatment. He had not been found innocent by reason of insanity, but his mental illness had been acknowledged as a factor. The sentencing came in May. Judge Patricia Jenkins imposed a term of 13 to 30 years in state prison. John DuPont, then 58 years old, was led away in handcuffs. The man who had lived his entire life on an 800-acre estate, surrounded by servants and luxury, would spend his remaining years in a cell. He would never return to Foxcatcher Farm. The irony was not lost on observers. A man who had spent millions trying to build a legacy, trying to prove himself worthy of the DuPont name, would now be remembered primarily for this single act of violence. All the donations, all the museums, all the wrestling championships would be overshadowed by 3 gunshots on a winter afternoon. For Nancy Schultz, the verdict brought little comfort. Her husband was still dead. Her children, Alexander and Danielle, would still grow up without their father. The man who had murdered Dave in cold blood would receive psychiatric care in prison, but Dave would never receive anything again. In the months after the murder, Nancy had faced an impossible situation. 20 wrestlers who had been training at Foxcatcher Farm were suddenly homeless, their funding cut off, the Atlanta Olympics just months away. With remarkable strength, she founded the Dave Schultz Wrestling Club in March 1996, providing sponsorship and support for the displaced athletes. The club succeeded beyond its initial mission, continuing to train wrestlers for nearly a decade. Among those who trained under the club's sponsorship were some of the greatest American wrestlers of their generation. Kurt Angle, whom Dave had personally coached at Foxcatcher, won Olympic gold at the 1996 Atlanta Games, just months after his mentor's murder. Brandon Slay won gold at the 2000 Sydney Olympics. Patricia Miranda claimed bronze at the 2004 Athens Games. Dave Schultz's legacy lived on through the athletes he had trained and inspired, through the wrestling techniques he had pioneered, through the sportsmanship he had exemplified throughout his career. The wrestling community rallied around his memory. USA Wrestling established the annual Dave Schultz Memorial International Tournament, held each year at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. The National Wrestling Hall of Fame created the Dave Schultz Award, given annually to outstanding high school wrestlers in all 50 states who exemplify excellence in wrestling, academics, and citizenship. Dave Schultz was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. His legacy as one of America's greatest wrestlers and ambassadors for the sport secured forever. But what of Foxcatcher Farm itself, the estate that had witnessed so much history, from thoroughbred racing glory to Olympic wrestling triumph to cold-blooded murder? After John DuPont's conviction, the property began a slow decline. The dairy herd, nearly 70 prize Guernsey cattle that Jean DuPont had lovingly cultivated over decades, was sold off at auction in the fall of 1996. The animals scattered to farms across the region, the careful bloodlines Jean had maintained now dispersed beyond recovery. The Delaware Museum of Natural History, which held the dairy farm in trust, sold its portion of the property in 1998 for over $15 million. The wrestling facility, once the premier training center in the nation, fell silent. The mats where Olympic champions had trained gathered dust. The weight room where Dave Schultz had pushed himself toward one final games stood empty. Weeds began to grow through cracks in the parking lot where his blood had stained the snow. John DuPont served his sentence at the State Correctional Institution at Mercer, in western Pennsylvania. He received regular psychiatric treatment, maintained on antipsychotic medications that kept his delusions somewhat in check. He rarely spoke publicly about the murder. In interviews granted from prison, he seemed unable or unwilling to fully acknowledge what he had done. The paranoid delusions that had driven him to kill Dave Schultz never entirely disappeared. They simply became muted, controlled by chemistry rather than cured. His will, drafted before his imprisonment, contained one final surprise. John DuPont left 80% of his estate to Valentin Yordanov, a Bulgarian wrestler who had trained at Foxcatcher and won Olympic gold at the 1996 Games. The bequest sparked a legal battle that continued for years after John's death, with his niece and nephew challenging the will. Eventually, the courts would uphold the original document, honoring John's final wishes even as they grappled with the madness that had consumed him. On December 9, 2010, John Liseter DuPont died in prison. He was 72 years old. The cause was chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a lung condition that had plagued him for years. He had served nearly 14 years of his sentence, never once returning to the estate where he had spent most of his life. His final years were spent in the routine of prison life, a far cry from the luxury he had known. The man who once commanded an 800-acre kingdom now lived in a small cell, his days structured by guards and medication schedules. The news of his death was met with mixed reactions. Some felt justice had been served. Others believed that a troubled man had finally found peace. And many simply felt sadness for a tragedy that had claimed two lives, one in a moment of violence, and one in a long, slow dissolution behind bars. The wrestling community, which had benefited so much from his generosity before the horror, struggled to reconcile the patron they had known with the murderer he became. The fate of Liseter Hall, the magnificent mansion where John DuPont had been born and raised, was perhaps the most poignant epilogue to this story. After John's death, the property was sold to developers. Toll Brothers, one of the nation's largest luxury home builders, purchased the land with plans to transform it into a master-planned community. In January 2013, the 90-year-old mansion was demolished. Glenn Miller Demolition brought in heavy equipment and reduced the white-columned house to rubble. The estate that had once symbolized DuPont wealth and prestige, that had hosted thoroughbred champions and Olympic wrestlers, that had witnessed both grandeur and horror, was erased from the landscape. Neighbors gathered to watch the destruction, some with sadness, others with relief that a dark chapter was finally closing. The demolition took only days, but it erased nearly a century of history from the Pennsylvania countryside. In its place, a luxury housing development called Liseter Estate now sprawls across 400 acres. Nearly 450 homes occupy land where John DuPont once wandered as a lonely child, where Welsh ponies and prize beagles once competed for ribbons, where wrestlers once trained for Olympic glory. A historical barn was preserved and converted into a clubhouse for the new residents. But the mansion itself, with all its memories, is gone forever. What lessons can be drawn from the tragedy of Foxcatcher Farm? The story raises uncomfortable questions about wealth and mental illness, about the failures of systems designed to protect the public, about the ways we enable dangerous behavior when it comes wrapped in money and status. John DuPont showed signs of serious mental illness for years before the murder. His erratic behavior was dismissed as eccentricity. His paranoid delusions were tolerated because he was rich enough to insulate himself from consequences. The wrestlers who feared him stayed because they needed his money. The police who were called to the property did nothing because he was a prominent citizen. His family, long estranged, did not intervene. His employees, dependent on his paychecks, kept quiet. Everyone assumed that someone else would step in, that the situation would resolve itself, that a man of such wealth could not possibly be a real threat. They were wrong, and a good man paid the price for their assumptions. The truth is that mental illness does not discriminate. It afflicts the rich as readily as the poor, the powerful as easily as the powerless. But wealth can mask the symptoms, can buy silence and discretion, can create a bubble where reality itself becomes negotiable. John DuPont lived in such a bubble for most of his life. He never had to face the consequences of his behavior. He never had to confront the reality of his deteriorating mental state. And in the end, that bubble burst in the most terrible way imaginable. With blood on the snow and a good man dead, Dave Schultz deserved better. He was, by every account, one of the finest human beings to ever compete in the sport of wrestling. He overcame childhood bullying and learning disabilities to become a world champion. He treated every opponent with respect, every young wrestler with patience, every stranger with kindness. He learned Russian so he could communicate with competitors from other countries. He named his son after a foreign rival who had become a friend. He was the kind of person who makes the world a little better simply by being in it. And he was taken from that world by a man whose wealth had shielded him from the help he desperately needed. Nancy Schultz would eventually remarry, finding happiness again after years of grief. She continued to advocate for wrestling and for the memory of her first husband, speaking at events and supporting young athletes who reminded her of Dave. Alexander and Danielle Schultz grew up in the shadow of tragedy, carrying their father's legacy with them into adulthood. They learned to navigate a world that knew their father's name, that recognized his face from old Olympic footage, that sometimes asked painful questions about the day he died. The wrestling community never forgot Dave Schultz. His name is invoked whenever young wrestlers are taught about sportsmanship, about integrity, about what it means to be a champion both on and off the mat. Coaches tell stories about his kindness, his patience, his willingness to help anyone who asked. His techniques are still taught in wrestling rooms across the country, his influence living on through generations of athletes he never had the chance to meet. The story of Foxcatcher Farm has been told and retold in books, documentaries, and films. Mark Schultz wrote his own account in Foxcatcher. The true story of my brother's murder, John DuPont's madness, and the quest for Olympic gold. A New York Times bestseller that provided an intimate look at the relationship between the wrestlers and their troubled patron. ESPN's 30 for 30 series produced The Prince of Pennsylvania, a documentary that featured interviews with former Team Foxcatcher members and offered new perspectives on the tragedy. And the 2014 movie Foxcatcher, directed by Bennett Miller, brought the story to a new audience worldwide. Steve Carell's portrayal of John DuPont earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, capturing the unsettling blend of neediness and menace that characterized the troubled millionaire. Carell transformed himself physically for the role, wearing a prosthetic nose and adopting a hunched posture that made him nearly unrecognizable. Mark Ruffalo played Dave Schultz with warmth and humanity, earning his own Oscar nomination. Channing Tatum portrayed Mark Schultz, the brother who escaped Foxcatcher before the worst happened. The film introduced millions to a story that had faded from public memory, reminding them that even the wealthiest families harbor darkness. Today, if you drive through Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, you will find little trace of Foxcatcher Farm. The wrestling facility is gone. The mansion is gone. The stables and training grounds have been replaced by suburban homes with carefully manicured lawns. The Episcopal Academy, a private school founded in 1785, now occupies a portion of the former estate, its modern campus standing where thoroughbreds once ran. The new residents of Liseter Estate may not even know the history of the land beneath their feet. They may not know that a lonely boy once wandered these acres with no one to play with. They may not know that champion horses once thundered across these fields, carrying the Foxcatcher colors to victory. They may not know that Olympic wrestlers once trained here, pushing their bodies to the limit in pursuit of gold medals and American glory. And they may not know that on a cold January afternoon, a man was murdered in his own driveway, shot by someone he had trusted, someone he had tried to help, someone whose mind had finally shattered beyond repair. But the story endures. It endures in the memories of those who knew Dave Schultz, who still speak of his kindness and his skill. It endures in the tournaments and awards that bear his name, honoring young wrestlers who embody his spirit. It endures in the cautionary tale of John DuPont, a reminder that wealth cannot buy happiness or sanity, that privilege cannot protect us from the darkest corners of the human mind. And it endures in the questions that still hang in the air, unanswered after all these years. Why did John DuPont kill his best friend? What finally pushed him over the edge? Could anyone have stopped him? The truth is that we may never know. The mind of John DuPont remains a mystery, a labyrinth of paranoia and delusion that no psychiatric evaluation could fully map. He took his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only fragments of explanation, only hints at the terror that consumed him. Perhaps he truly believed that Dave Schultz was trying to kill him. Perhaps some deeper resentment, some twisted jealousy, drove him to destroy the man who had everything he could never have. Or perhaps there was no reason at all, only the chaos of a diseased brain misfiring in the worst possible way. What we do know is that two families were shattered on that January day in 1996. The Schultz family lost a husband, a father, a brother, a son. The DuPont family, already distant from their troubled relative, lost whatever remained of their connection to John. An estate that had stood for nearly a century was eventually demolished. A fortune that could have done so much good was consumed by legal battles and psychiatric care. And a sport that had celebrated one of its greatest champions was forced to mourn him instead. Standing where Foxcatcher Farm once stood, you might feel the weight of all that history. The dreams and the nightmares, the glory and the tragedy, the hope that built a world-class training facility, and the madness that destroyed it. If walls could speak, the walls of Liseter Hall would have told a story of isolation and longing, of a boy who wanted love and a man who found only fear. But those walls are gone now, reduced to rubble and memory. What remains is the story itself, a story of ambition and madness, of wealth and ruin, of friendship and betrayal. A story that reminds us how fragile life can be, how quickly everything can change, how the people we trust can become the people we fear. Dave Schultz walked toward that silver Lincoln, expecting nothing more than a conversation. He had no way of knowing that his life was about to end. None of us ever do. We walk through our days assuming tomorrow will come, assuming the people around us are who they seem to be, assuming that the world makes sense. And then, in an instant, everything shatters. The snow has long since melted from that driveway. The blood has been washed away. The man who pulled the trigger is dead. The man who fell is remembered as a hero. And somewhere in the quiet suburbs of Pennsylvania, children play on grass that once knew champions, unknowing inheritors of a legacy written in gold medals and gunpowder, in triumph and tears. This was Foxcatcher Farm. This was the house that John DuPont built and destroyed. This was the stage for a tragedy that America will never forget.